All right, let me pray for us and we will get going. Father, thank you so much for this time this morning to gather together and to study during this first part, to think through these truths that we get to read in our London Baptist Confession, to familiarize ourselves with them. And to just reap the benefits of faithful pastors, faithful men who came generations before us, and to read their truth this truth succinctly stated by them. I pray our time this morning would be helpful, that for each of us personally, that we would think better of you, be more in awe of you, and be those who live in greater thankfulness and appreciation for your grace in condescending to reveal yourself to us, and our need for you through the gift of these covenants that we're going to talk about. Pray these things. Thank you for these things. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. All right, so we're in chapter 7 of the London Baptist Confession. Last week, we began to look at chapter 7, we kind of began to look at it, but we didn't even really get into the first paragraph. But what we did was just spend some time laying some important foundational concepts on the issue of covenant. Chapter 7 is of God's covenant. We noted that in this chapter, that the London Baptist Confession differs pretty significantly from its parent documents, the Westminster Confession and the Savoy Declaration. So this is the kind of the big one of all of the previous chapters. This one is the one that differs the most significantly from the Westminster Confession. So up to this point, we've pointed out a few notable exceptions where the London Baptist Confession deviates just a little bit, changes wording here and there, adds phrases from the first London Baptist Confession, but not so much a dropping of stuff. But in this chapter, chapter 7, there is by far the most variance. The Westminster Confession, as we said last week, has 6 paragraphs. The Savoy Declaration has 5, and the London Baptist only has 3. Paragraph 1, which we'll look at today, is the one that's pretty similar with just a few variations in wording. That's more similar to the type of differences that we're used to looking at the other chapters. Our paragraph 2 is pretty close to the Westminster paragraph 3, and we completely omit paragraph 2 of the Westminster. We'll talk a little bit about that today. And then our paragraph 3 is completely different in every way from the Westminster and Savoy, using totally different terminology, leaving certain things out. The London Baptist Confession framers were just meant to take that they judge that biblical faithfulness demands a significant departure from the Presbyterians at this point, because it is a lot of, I'm not sure I mentioned this last week, but a lot of the idea of covenant and misunderstandings of God's covenant is what leads to the practice of infant baptism. So that's why they're very careful here. We talked about, so if we wanted to outline these paragraphs, I gave the outline of paragraph 1, being the point being the necessity of covenant, or of a covenant. Paragraph 2, the focus and implementation of the covenant. And paragraph 3, the features of the covenant. And then a reminder, general definition of what a covenant is just a formal agreement or treaty between two parties that contains obligations and regulations. So We spent almost the entirety of our time last week just going through the different covenants that we see God making with his people in the Bible. So what we call biblical covenants. So we briefly talked about the covenant of works, and we kind of put a little asterisk next to that one. Because it's not actually, even though covenantal language is kind of used there, we'll examine that a little bit more at the end of our time today. But there's debate over whether or not it's a covenant found in Genesis 2:16 and 17, because it's not ever, the Bible doesn't ever call it a covenant, never uses the word covenant to talk about it. But there is language there that justifies that. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. So that one, the first place where the word covenant is actually used is the Noahic covenant, which is in Genesis 6:18, and then kind of laid out more specifically in 8:20 through 9:17. We won't go through all that again, but that's the first place where the word covenant is actually used. So some of the promises in this covenant were that there's going to be a stability in nature from that point on. God's covenant with Noah. Noah, once again, is told to be fruitful and multiply. We're also told there's a promise of that animal kind will fear man, the wonderful promise that now animals can become food, and we see also, man's life as the image of God declared to be sacred and protected. Capital punishment is instituted, and most significantly of the promises in here, God promises never to destroy the world by water again. And then it's given the sign of that covenant is the rainbow. And so that covenant was an unconditional, what we call an unconditional unilateral, it's everlasting covenant, and it's still in effect today. And you can see every time that it rains and the world isn't destroyed, God being faithful to that covenant. Not that parts of the world aren't still destroyed, like your roofs sometimes, but overall, the world is not destroyed through water, and it will never be. So there's the Noahic covenant. We talked about that. The Abrahamic covenant. Genesis is found many places throughout the life of Abraham. Genesis 12:1 through 3, 12:6 through 7, Genesis 13, Genesis 15, Genesis 17, Genesis 8, Genesis 22. And so within that, there's a lot of promises in that covenant. Abraham is promised to be a great nation. God promises Abraham that he will bless him and make his name great, and that Abraham will be a blessing to others, that God will treat others and other nations with blessing and cursing based on how they treat Abraham, that through Abraham, all families of the earth will be blessed. There's land that's promised to Abraham and his descendants, promises that land to Abraham forever. God promises to be a shield and a reward to Abraham. He promises that Abraham's descendants will be numerous, that Abraham will multiply exceedingly, that Abraham will be the father of a multitude of nations, and then circumcision is given as a sign of that covenant. And it's, again, this is one that God unconditionally obligates himself to. It's an unconditional, unilateral covenant once again. And we talked about the Mosaic covenant. So again, just summing up, we're not going to read all of these places, but laid out. Actually, we're going to look at this one again in a little bit, but not right now anyway. But in this one, you see there's a lot of commandments given in the Ten Commandments part of this covenant, chapter 20, as well as rules for living, chapters 21 through 23 of Exodus. Rules for worship in Exodus 25 through 31. The sign of this covenant is the keeping of the Sabbath. That's what it says in Exodus 31. And this covenant is unique among these other ones in that it was a bilateral, it's conditional, it's contingent on Israel's obedience. And so you're told in Deuteronomy 28 and 29, there's going to be blessings for obedience, cursings, and judgment for disobedience. All right, so there's that covenant. There's the priestly covenant from Numbers 25, where Phinehas is honored by God. He's promised to have a perpetual priesthood through him. That's another covenant, a less well-known covenant. Then there's the Davidic covenant from 2 Samuel 7, where God promises that David's name will be made great, that there will be a place appointed for Israel, that the unrighteous will afflict Israel no more. He promises to establish the kingdom of David through his, so there's two different parts of this. Through his immediate seed, he talks of part of that covenant is that his son, who we know to be Solomon, will build the temple, that Solomon will be reproved when he commits iniquity, and that God will not take the kingdom from him when he disobeys. So there's that part of the covenant that's specifically to Solomon, but then there's also the promise of Christ that we see in there, of David's dynasty and David's kingdom will be established before God forever, and his throne shall be established forever. That's probably the most significant part of that covenant. All right, and again, that is a unilateral, unconditional covenant that God makes. He's going to do this no matter what. I mean, there's even stipulations, even though it's admitted that Solomon's going to fail, he's going to commit iniquity and going to be reproved in it. That's built into the covenant. All right, and so then there's that covenant. Then the new covenant, which is in Jeremiah 31 and Ezekiel 36. Again, another unconditional, unilateral, eternal covenant. God does everything in this covenant. He brings, in this covenant, Ezekiel promises that Israel will be brought into their own land. Again, that's initially, there's promises initially made to Israel, but then that extend out to the Gentiles as well. There's the promise of a new heart, that they will obey God with no more need of threat. There's a promise that the heart of stone will be replaced by a heart of flesh, and that God will cause his people to walk in his ways, and that God will put his spirit in his people. So these are what we call the biblical covenant. So let me ask this question. We kind of ended here last time. Do I have mic people? I do. I have Ian and Jesse. All right. Within those covenants, because this is important as we go on, I'll just ask one question, and you just pick which one you want to answer, or both. As you just point to examples of continuity within them, how are they the same? How do they build off of each other? And also areas of discontinuity. Where are places in those covenants that you see that's unique to one covenant and not the others? What do you guys see in there? Does that make sense? Where do you see similarities within the covenants where they build on one another, or maybe you can follow a similar thread? And what are some examples of things that would be just unique to that covenant? Yeah, Natalie.
I'm thinking of the Abrahamic covenant and the Davidic covenant. Abraham was promised that through his seed all the earth would be blessed, and it was fulfilled in David's line through Jesus Christ to bless the whole world, and then that fulfilled David's covenant as well.
Yeah, Abraham's descendants find their fulfillment, and David's descendants who eventually find further fulfillment. Yeah.
So the similarity would be they're all working towards God's decree for the world and his plan. So each one of these are building in their own unique way what God is fulfilling throughout the ages. The differences that I guess I'm not quite sure. I mean, where do you start with the differences? But I think in a nutshell, what comes to my mind is that they're all addressing different aspects of that decree as he's working these things out, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, good. No, that's good. What else? What else do you guys see? Yeah, Chuck, and then Ian right in. Oh, never mind. Go to Betsy first. All right. All right. We'll come back to you, Rob. Yeah.
Well, I think from what I'm seeing here in my notes is that all the unconditional covenants, it's all God. God is doing this. He is the one behind. He ensures the completion and the keeping of the covenants. And so in my understanding, it really, I mean, they all have some element of grace.
Yeah.
But these are really precursors of why we are believers today, and what he's done in our hearts today is a total God work of regeneration in our hearts. And all of these things, every believer that comes into his fold is a working out of these covenants where God is, it's all God.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, there's a constant line of God, and you mentioned the word grace. That's important. There's a thread of grace that goes through and builds on all of them. Yeah, Betsy.
Well, I think the main difference that I see is in the new covenant, where the Holy Spirit we're given a new heart and a new, the old heart of stone is taken out of. But at the same time, there is continuity there, because, I mean, you look back at David, and he wasn't bootstrapping all of this stuff. The Holy Spirit was with him too. So there's continuity, but there's also a difference. So not real clear on that.
Yeah, it's good. Well, no, so you picked up the continuity from the new covenant, even to the Mosaic covenant. I will put in you a new spirit so that you will obey my commands. What commands? The ones that we see laid out in the Mosaic covenant. Yeah, good. Anyone else? Yeah, Lori.
Well, Chuck referred to the unconditional part, which was in most of them. But in the Mosaic covenant, it is conditional, because God said, he kept saying, if you obey my commandments, if you obey my commandments. So that one is more conditional.
Yeah. Yeah, there's conditional in there. All right. Yeah. So good. Good answers. And the reason I just wanted to bring these out is because kind of that's how we ended our time last time, is talking about the two kind of major errors that can be made when thinking through the covenants, is one, to either totally flatten the covenants by removing all distinctions and making them sound like, no, it's just one covenant that's slowly revealed. There's aspects to that we can call progressive revelation, that we see God's plan revealed more, but there's still distinctions, like especially specific stuff about Solomon that's part of the covenant, specific promises about land, which kind of runs through all of them, the land promise, but specific promises about it are different. Some of the specific things about Abraham, in him specifically, that's a little different than other things. So there's distinctions to be made in there. So that's one issue. But then another issue, maybe a more dangerous issue, is to not see the continuity, not to see how they do in fact build on one another, not to see to almost look at it as like God is doing something different in these different places. He's working differently with Abraham, and he's acting differently with him than he does with Moses and the Israelites, and he's acting differently with him than he is with that's a even bigger, probably, or that can lead to even more issues if you do that. So we wanted to point those things out. So make sure we have that kind of framework. So remind ourselves of what's in these covenants, and have that framework in our mind as we go through. So we spent our time slowly going through all of those so that we would have the various biblical covenants in our head as we head into this. As we go through these paragraphs, so that's kind of what we need to see. it isn't one single one of these covenants that's in mind, but rather it's the overall concept of covenant that we see in paragraph 1, and then in paragraphs 2 and 3, it's also the reference when it's talking about covenant to that progressive revelation of God's grace in salvation that is revealed in the continuity of the covenants as they're given. So that's what's referred to in paragraph 2 that we'll look more at next time as the covenant of grace, is a concept, a theological covenant. There's none of these specific covenants are called the covenant of grace. The covenant of grace, rather, refers to the continuity of these covenants that follow the what's said in Genesis 2. All right, but so with that in mind, we'll expand on those things here in a bit. But with that in mind, let's take a look at the first paragraph, which we gave the title of The Necessity of Covenant. So paragraph 1 says, "The distance between God and the creature is so great that although reasonable creatures do owe obedience to him as their creator, yet they could never have attained the reward of life but by some voluntary condescension on God's part, which he hath been pleased to express by way of covenant." So notice what it says that the need for covenant is based on. This is interesting because our first answer might be, why do we need covenant? Because God is holy and we're sinners. So God has to condescend to us. But notice that's not what it says. It's not sin that is the basis of the need for covenant. It is the creator-creature distinction. The distance between God and the creature is so great. So even if we were sinless, there would still be need of covenant. God would still have to condescend to us to speak to us. We're still dependent on him. The distance between us and God isn't just a moral distance. It's not just because we're sinners and he is holy. That's not it. That adds to it in some way. But it's based in some of those things we talked about earlier in previous chapters. That God is incomprehensible even if our minds were not corrupted by the curse of sin. He is still incomprehensible. He is still so far beyond us. So then, apart from God's decision to approach and speak to Adam, Adam would have no ability to understand the specific things that are required of him by God. So we need God to, in a sense, step down and reveal himself and what he wants from us. That is the basis for the need of covenant. And that's why we can kind of argue that thing in Genesis 2:16 through 17, could be described as a covenant. So we need God to step down, essentially, and reveal himself, show himself to us. That is the basis of covenant, the creator-creature distinction. And then that next phrase says that although reasonable creatures do owe obedience to them or to him as their creator, and so that phrase reminds us of the truth of Romans 1, that just the fact that we are reasonable. So this says reasonable. That's not a compliment to all of us. It doesn't mean some of you are unreasonable still. But the idea is the phrase there. It just means rational or responsible, or we have the ability to reason. This is the reminder. What you have there is the reminder that all humankind owes obedience to God just by nature of that creator-creature distinction, and specifically the fact that he's created us in the image of God, that he's made us rational beings. This point is the reason for, so if you looked up those two verses, you'd be like, what is it? Those two verses that it gives there from Job and Luke? You'd be like, what? I don't understand why those verses are there. But Job 35:7-8 says, if you are righteous, what do you give to him? Or what does he receive from your hand? Your wickedness is for a man like yourself, and your righteousness is for a son of man. So the concept there of, like, you're not doing anything special when you obey or when you do what you're supposed to do. Luke 17:7-10, this parable that Jesus gives, which of you having a slave plowing or tending sheep will say to him when he has come in from the field, come immediately and sit down to eat? But will he not say to him, prepare something for me to eat, and clothing yourself properly, serve me while I eat and drink, and afterward you may eat and drink? Is he grateful to the slave because he did the things which were commanded? In this way, you also, when you do the things which are commanded of you, say, we are unworthy slaves. We have done only that which we ought to have done. The point to these, in these two passages, is just to put us in our place as creation. That's why they cite them. The reminder that our very existence in creation, as God's image bearers, as the only rational beings who can comprehend such things, just that alone demands our obedience to and allegiance to God. He doesn't, just by our existence, the fact that we exist demands that. He doesn't have to tell us to do anything. We just owe that to him as creatures, as those who have been created. So that's why they bring up those two. And yet we are told that this truth, even in an unfallen state, even for Adam, would have that truth that as a creature you owe allegiance to the Creator. But even in an unfallen state, that is insufficient to ever allow for humanity to, as it says, to attain the reward of life apart from the willing condescension of God to his creation. That's what that phrase there. Yet they could never have attained the reward of life, but by some voluntary condescension on God's part. God has to do that. So the reward of life, when that promise there, in that phrase, is not just in reference to being alive. That's not the reward of life. Just existing in a state of not being dead. That's not what it means by the reward of life. The reward of life is the result of God's decision, just not being dead. All of you being alive and not being dead, that's just the result of God's decision to create those who would be in his image. That's not the reward of life. The reward of life is in reference to true eternal life, in which those created in God's image get to live in continued unbroken communion with God, our Creator. That's what's in reference when it talks about the reward of life, not just you existing. But again, though, even in the original creation, when God spoke to a sinless Adam, Genesis 2:15 and 17, this is that passage that's used to talk about the covenant of works. Then Yahweh, God, took the man and set him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it. And Yahweh, God, commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may surely eat, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat from it, for in the day that you eat from it you will surely die. So, even Adam, even in his unfallen state, not in sin yet, how would Adam know the conditions for having the reward of life and having continuing relationship with God if God had not condescended and told him? That's a specific command that doesn't just come natural to the conscience. I shouldn't eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He had to know about it. So Adam might have been created, used his rational mind to understand that there is a creator, and that he owes allegiance to whoever created him, but he would not have had any understanding of a relationship with God or the requirements of this God on his life had God not said something to him. So this condescension of God, this communication of him to his creation about how this reward of life may be attained, is done by way of covenant. That's the last phrase that we see there, which God hath been pleased to express by way of covenant. So covenant, again, essentially just a formal agreement between two or more parties with obligations and regulations. So there is generally some sort of pact or contract. It involves promises and stipulations. Many times it involves witnesses being around. It involves oaths being taken. It involves signs to demonstrate the covenant has taken place. It's more than just a promise to do something. It also expresses the serious nature of that which is being agreed upon by stating consequences for not keeping the covenant. So the consequences are there not just as a warning, but to show you how big of a deal it is. Right? How big of a deal it is. So we talked about in the Abrahamic covenant when that fire pot moves through the cut pieces of animal. Now that is God essentially demonstrating the custom of covenant at the time, which we'll talk about in a second, of moving through the pieces, saying, if I break my covenant, may my fate be the same as these dead animals, the blood of which he's moving through. But there's no danger of God ever breaking his covenant. He's not going to do it. He doesn't need to promise to do something like we talked about in the sermon last week. That's not going to happen. Rather, showing that, though, or having him do that, demonstrates the seriousness of what he is saying, of this covenant. So, it's more than just a promise to do something. It's also an expression of the serious nature of the agreement, of the treaty that's taking place. And the concept of covenants, not just in the Bible, but it's present throughout that time and throughout that culture. And we see, it continues on, we see the references of it to this day. So you see that in marriage ceremonies, there's a covenant taken. You see it in business or legal contracts. When you see a contract sign, that's a sign of a covenant. Different laws, different immigration policies. More explicitly, we use, and we're explicit about it, use the language of covenant in our church membership covenant. We expect our people to have a biblical understanding of a covenant, so we can use that language and we feel good about it. So we see ourselves as entering into a covenant with God and each other when we become members of the church. We have you all sign the covenant. We state the covenant in front of everyone. And the reason we do that is because we understand it as a serious thing. We obligate ourselves to one another and to God. And we even do it, right? Our language in our covenant, we do it in a unilateral way, right? If you read our covenant language, much like God does in most of his biblical covenants, the Noahic, the Abrahamic, the Davidic, the New Covenant, with, as you guys mentioned, the bilateral one being the Mosaic. But our covenant, our church covenant, is in a unilateral way. You notice our church covenant doesn't have any ifs in it, right? When you said it, I will do this and this and this if, you guys do that. I'll do this for God and my fellow church members if God does this for me, or if my fellow church members do this for me. We leave that out. The same way we do that in marriage vows, right? Your marriage vows don't get any ifs in them. They shouldn't anyway. That's why you get married at our church, and we will not put any ifs in their marriage vows. That's not what you do. Don't say it's not I don't say, do you, and then the groom says, I do. If she, nope, that will end the wedding day, and and I will not pronounce you man and wife if you try and throw that in while we're doing the wedding ceremony. So there's no ifs in that. Covenants among God's people, where we are essentially doing what we're doing. We're making this covenant before God. We generally follow along the lines of these unilateral covenants. He is the one who stands as witness, and it's not that we necessarily trust the people we're making a covenant with to do everything, or so we're trusting in God, and we're making that covenant for Him. We entrust ourselves and our words to Him. So again, this is different than the type of bilateral covenants that we take when we go into like an employee or employer situation, and I would recommend that you do have some ifs in those contracts that you sign. I will do this work for you whether you pay me or not. No, don't. That's not what we do in those situations. But you see that in those contracts. If I do this work, then this is the salary that you will receive. If I don't, then I'm in violation of this contract, and my actions give reason for it to be voided. Those are the bilateral covenants that we see in contracts like that. So we see covenantal concepts carried over into society today. Christians, when we do it, we generally make and keep them more in the pattern of God. We have a better understanding of these things, or at least we ought to. And we are, but even so, we can't make covenants the same way that God makes covenants, because there's no way we can ever have the same position in any relationship we have that God has with us. So we are helped by thinking through the covenantal pattern of the time in which the biblical covenants were given. And there was a fantastic study done by a man named George Mendenhall that really kind of revolutionized and helped people to think through covenants better. This was done in like the 1950s, I think. He published research that analyzed ancient Hittite treaties between Hittite kings and their vassals. And these covenants were the standard form for all covenants that were around that time through all the ancient Near East, and as well as in Israel. So it's not just something that we see in the Bible, but this was kind of the recognized how things were in that time. But George Mendenhall demonstrated that there was a common structural framework that he's found consistent within all of these treaties, and it's a framework that we see in the covenants that God makes with mankind. So these are known as suzerain vassal covenants or treaties, suzerain vassal. So the suzerain is the Lord or the king or the master, the one in power in the situation, and the vassal is the subject or the one without power in a covenantal situation. So when we talk about our like marriage vows, it's not the same thing as this. There's some implications, some things that are the same, but what we see here is in the suzerain vassal covenants, they're always initiated by the dominant party, the suzerain, the king, because the vassal, the subject, has no power to do anything. They don't get to call the king into some sort of demand on how they need to be ruled. Here's how I have decided you need to rule me. That doesn't work. You don't have that power. But Mendenhall's research indicated that in these covenants, there's a consistent structure. There's various parts that are common to some extent that can be, and they're identified by certain types of language, which demonstrate that a covenant was being made. So first, there's a preamble in the covenant. So it's a preamble was something that identified who the suzerain power is, and the power that he had, the indication that he is the author of the agreement and that he has the power to initiate it. So it would be I the king, who of all of these lands, who have power over this area, like something like that, initiate this covenant. So there's a preamble. Second, then there's some sort of historical prologue. So what the king has done on behalf of this person, these people. So how the king, so he might be, or how the king became king. I am the rightful king because I'm in the line of these people. Or I am the king who defends your borders, or who won such and such a battle to give you this land. Something like that. So some sort of historical prologue to say why he is who he is and why he has power over these people. So preamble, and then second, some sort of historical prologue. Third, there's promises and stipulations for the covenant. So you pay such and such amount of tax, and I will provide whatever service for you. I will protect you from this invading army as you provide, a certain portion of wheat or whatever. So we see that. I will protect you as you do this thing for me. So promises and stipulations of the covenant. And then fourth, sanctions, so benefits and blessings, or punishment and cursings. So the result, so this is what will happen to those who keep the covenant. If you keep this covenant, this is what will happen. If you do not keep this covenant, this was what will happen. So sanctions, the results of keeping or breaking the covenant. So that's the fourth part. Fifth, there's usually some sort of a vow or an oath that establishes the covenant, an oath or a promise to do something, however that might be. And that can look different in these covenants in a lot of different ways. Sixth, there was some sort, and this is what was fascinating, because anyone who's read the Bible has seen this all the time, but in all of these places, there's some sort of cutting rite or blood rite. Again, to show the seriousness of the covenant. Someone would cut themselves, or blood would be involved somewhere to demonstrate the life and death seriousness of this covenant that's being made. So these points make up the framework of these suzerain vassal treaties that were common among the people of the Near East at this time. They're also common. You see man-to-man covenants in a few places in the Bible also. But you see these types of covenants. So there's generally then some sort of pact or contract, and it's done with these 6 things. You see them in there somewhere. So with that in mind, let's look at the Mosaic covenant and see some of these things in place there. So turn to Exodus 20. Exodus 20. We'll flip around in a couple of places there. But if you look at Exodus 20, which is a very famous portion of the Bible, because it is where we get the 10 Commandments, or where we see or at least the first stating of the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20. And you just see how he starts. So Exodus 21 doesn't start with the first commandment. It starts out this way. Then God spoke all these words, saying, I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And then goes into the commandments. So you see these things. You see the preamble there, the I am Yahweh your God, and the historical prologue, I brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of slavery. Here is what I have done on your behalf. And then he goes into the 10 commandments. So if you've ever noticed that before, that Exodus 20, the commandments don't actually start till verse 3. It's because the first 2 verses have that covenantal language in them leading into it. If you flip back to 19:3 through 6, again, this is starting. This is as Yahweh is beginning to unfold the covenant. You see, Moses went up to God, and Yahweh called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the sons of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I lifted you up on eagle's wings and brought you to myself." So there again, you see preamble language, and you see the historical prologue. Here is what I have done for you. And he says, "So now then, if you will indeed listen to my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel." So again, you see in there, you see some of the promises and stipulations for the keeping of the covenant. And if you go to, we got to go, flip over a few more pages to Exodus 24. So the Mosaic covenant stretches way out across these chapters, but you can see all of these things in here. Exodus 24, we'll just read 1 through 8. Then he said to Moses, "Come up to Yahweh, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and you shall all worship at a distance. Moses alone, however, shall come near to Yahweh, but they shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him." Then Moses came and recounted to the people all the words of Yahweh and all the judgments, and all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words which Yahweh has spoken, we will do." And Moses wrote down all the words of Yahweh, and then he arose early in the morning, built an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men and the sons of Israel, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as peace offerings to Yahweh. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and the other half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, "All that Yahweh has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient." So Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, "Behold, the blood of the covenant which Yahweh has cut with you in accordance with all these words." So you see in there, you see more the promises and stipulations, you see the sanctions, you see the vow that the people are making, and you see that cutting rite, that blood rite. There's the cutting and the blood of the covenant. And then, well, we won't go there, but read, you can go home, read Deuteronomy 28, and you see this extended section of cursing and blessing for the keeping or the breaking of the covenant. So that, as an example, as you look through all of these places where the Mosaic covenant is stipulated, you can see all of the framework of the suzerain and vassal covenants that would be familiar to everyone around this time. And so then what is so striking then is how often in these other covenants, not the Mosaic covenant necessarily, but you see all of these things in different places, but you see them done unilaterally. Promises made that God obligates himself to apart from any obligations of the vassal. There is, again, bilateral obligation within the Mosaic covenant, but it is still built on, and this is what's interesting, and kind of what Betsy was kind of going at with her answer earlier, but it's still built on the unilateral covenants that precede it, and it leads to further unilateral covenants coming out of it. So the reason we get to the Mosaic covenant is because of the unilateral covenants made to Abraham, and then you get there, and then you see the obligations, and then Israel cannot fulfill these obligations, and so you see more unilateral covenants made to David, and then in the new covenant. See, you can't do these things. You're failing at them, so I will make you want to obey these commands. I will put my spirit in you. I will change your heart. So, so we'll look at that again more next time, and as we look at especially paragraph 2 and into 3, as we talk about that covenant of grace, that thing that the string that goes through all of these covenants. But for now, so with all of that in mind, then I want to flip back to Genesis 2 for our last 4 minutes. And I want us to think through then what is referred to as the covenant of works in Genesis 2. So look at Genesis 2, 15 through 17, and we mentioned how careful the London Baptist Confession is with this concept of the covenant of works. You look at 2:15 through 17, then Yahweh God took the man and set him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and keep it. And Yahweh God commanded the man, saying, from any tree of the garden you may surely eat, but from the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat from it, for in the day that you eat from it you will surely die. And I have, if time, ask this question. I don't have time, so I'm just going to ask it, but also answer it. So what aspects of the covenant do we see there? Do we see a preamble? We kind of do, because in verse 15, then Yahweh God, and the LSB is so helpful here because it reminds us that the covenant name for God is being given here. Even though, so remember, Moses is writing this after he knows the covenant name of God, Yahweh, and so he puts it in here to remind us of who this God is. Even though the covenant name is given later, and Adam did not understand him quite that way, Moses reminds us of it. Is there a historical prologue? Again, kind of in the description, because it says God is the one who set him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate it and keep it. Are there promises and stipulations? Yes, eat from any tree, but not the one tree, but not that one tree, not the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Of that tree you shall not eat of it, for in the day you eat of it, you will die. So again, and so the promises and stipulations, and there's a very familiar, the commands that are given there, it's a thou shalt not type of command, similar to the Mosaic covenant. You shall not eat of it. Eat from it. So there's promises and stipulations, or there's sanctions, yes, or you will surely die. Now, is there a vow or an oath? No, but that's kind of not needed yet at this point, right? There's no need for that yet. There's no sin or anything going on that would require, like Adam would have no reason for a vow or oath to mean anything at this point in the history of the world. Is there a blood rite? No, but again, the same deal. There's no death yet. So if God cut open an animal in front of Adam would not. That would freak him out. That would not. That wouldn't work. So you can see why, why this is kind of tricky. But even though the word covenant is not used here, there's nothing wrong with running from that term, or it's not right to run from that term. That's what I meant to say. There's nothing wrong with embracing it to an extent. It's probably safe to refer to it as a covenant in the form that it can exist at that time, and to call it the covenant of works. But it just gives us a great appreciation for our Baptist forefathers because, like we said, and they do recognize the term later on in chapters 19 and 20. It uses the word covenant of works. But it is here, and that's why we're covering it here, because normally, if we were doing a study of the Westminster Confession, if we were a bunch of Presbyterians, the next paragraph we would look at would be this paragraph. The first covenant made with man was a covenant of works, wherein life was promised to Adam and in him in his posterity, upon condition of perfect and personal obedience. But the Baptists dropped that paragraph. They completely cut it out. So what we can gather from that is, and from how the Baptists treat covenant of works later on, is that while they were comfortable with the terminology and comfortable using it, they were not comfortable confessing it as part of a necessary belief to understand. And so that I think that is such a safe place. I think you should be comfortable with the term covenant of works. I think it's there. I think you can see it there. But as far as confessing it as a covenant and making it an essential part of our faith, they're not comfortable doing that. So I think that's a good place for us to be. So if some of you are like I've never heard of this thing that you're talking about, covenant of works, covenant of grace. Some of you have read more stuff and seen this stuff out there, and so hopefully this is helpful, or maybe in the future building a foundation as you think through these things. But it's probably safe for us to be comfortable with the terminology, comfortable with seeing that covenantal structure there. But maybe not so much that we depend on calling it something that's essential to our faith. Hosea 6, by the way, I meant to bring this up. This would be your biblical warrant for for being comfortable with it. If you're still not comfortable with calling it a covenant, Hosea 6 and 7, for I delight in loving kindness rather than sacrifice, and in the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. But like Adam, they have trespassed against the covenant. There they have dealt treacherously against me. So Hosea kind of refers to what happened with Adam as a covenant. And he's most likely referring to that time. So it's, again, good. It's something we should be comfortable with. And it's the first of what we call 3 theological covenants. The next one being the covenant of grace, another one being the covenant of redemption. We'll talk about those more next week. All right, let me close this in prayer. God, thank you so much for this time. Thank you for the opportunity to think through these things together. And I pray that if nothing else, that each of us were strengthened this morning in just our understanding, our awe of you, our thankfulness of you, rejoicing in you, that you are so gracious, so kind, as to covenant with a mankind who is so beneath you, even apart from sin. But even more so with the complication of sin added, and how gracious and kind you are to us. And that kindness, the grace of God that we see in these covenants, in the covenant that you make with us, would motivate us, strengthen us, embolden us to selfless obedience. That it would help us to, no matter what context that we're in, no matter what trials we're dealing with, things going on around us, how others are, how our relationships might be failing around us, how we're treated by others, all of those things, that in light of the truth of your kindness, your graciousness to saving us through these covenants, that it would cause us to rejoice in obedience. Obedience no matter the context that we're in. Pray these things in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right. You're dismissed for 25 minutes.